Bienvenidos! Welcome everybody! Today we're talking about Spanish gerunds, how to use them correctly, when to avoid them, and how to sound more like a native speaker. Comencemos! First, what exactly is a gerund? In English, gerunds end in ing, like eating or running. In Spanish, they end in ANDO for AOR verbs and IENDO for EOR and IOR verbs. And usually, a gerund means there's an action in progress. For example, hablar becomes hablando, speaking. Comer becomes comiendo, eating. Vivir becomes viviendo, living. So for AOR verbs, to find a gerund, you just take the AOR part and replace it with ANDO. And for EOR and IOR verbs, you take that part off and replace it with IENDO. So let's practice a little bit. Can you think of a verb and try forming it in the gerund in Spanish? How about trabajar? It becomes trabajando. How about for the verb leer, to read? What would the gerund be for it? It actually is leyendo. So instead of saying yendo, because there are two vowels, we're going to change that first I to the letter Y. There are a few other exceptions. For example, when we see the verb pedir, there is a stem change from E to I or IE. So pedir becomes pidiendo. Pedir is to ask, pidiendo. Or with the stem changes from O to UE. For example, dormir becomes durmiendo. Here are a few other examples. For regular verbs, we see beber, to drink. It becomes bebiendo, drinking. Cocinar, to cook. It becomes cocinando, cooking. A few other irregular verbs are sentir, to feel. It becomes sintiendo, feeling. Mentir, to lie. It becomes mintiendo, lying. Decir, to say. It becomes diciendo, saying. All right, now that you've seen some examples of these verbs, how do we use them? The first and main way, similar to English, is to indicate an action in progress. So the progressive tenses. For this structure, we have to use the verb estar to form the different progressive tenses. In present, for example, we could say, estoy aprendiendo español. I am learning Spanish. Estoy aprendiendo español. Estás escribiendo un comentario. Estás escribiendo un comentario. You are writing a comment. Estás escribiendo un comentario. Él está trabajando. Él está trabajando. He is working. Él está trabajando. So these are very straightforward, very similar to the English version. You have to learn the verb conjugation for estar. And I'm going to leave it up on the screen for the present, past, and future tenses. Just like the ing verbs, in these sentences, the Spanish gerunds don't change. So we could change estoy aprendiendo español to the future progressive, estaré aprendiendo español. The structure doesn't change. A second way to use these verbs is to describe how an action is performed. For example, aprendí español escuchando música. Aprendí español escuchando música. I learned Spanish by listening to music. Aprendí español escuchando música. Él entró corriendo. Él entró corriendo. He entered running, or he was running when he entered. Él entró corriendo. Ella respondió gritando. Ella respondió gritando. She responded by shouting. Ella respondió gritando. So you can see here the main verb is in past tense. And then we see the Spanish gerund. They are describing the main action. It's harder to give you a structure for this situation. It is something that you're going to have to practice more and just pay attention to the past tenses. Generally speaking, when you use a verb in its past tense, you can't use another verb in the past, right? So when you say aprendí español, escuchó música, we can't say escuchó. We have to use escuchando. We have to use another form of the verb. Very similar to English. We can't say I learned Spanish by listened to music. We have to use another form. Download a free guide I've prepared to help you improve or learn Spanish in the next 30 days. You can find the link on the description. The third way to use the gerunds in Spanish is to express simultaneous actions. For example, caminaba pensando en su futuro. Caminaba pensando en su futuro. He was walking thinking about his future. Caminaba pensando en su futuro. Leía escuchando música. Leía escuchando música. He or she was reading while listening to music. Leía escuchando música. So similarly to number 2, the main verb is in the past tense. And then we're going to follow it up with another verb in its gerund form. Another way to use the gerunds in Spanish is to indicate ongoing actions. And we will usually use verbs like seguir or continuar. So seguir has different meanings. It could mean to continue, but it could also be to follow, to keep, to chase, to get. It varies greatly. And then continuar means to continue. For example, sigo aprendiendo español. It's an ongoing action. Sigo aprendiendo español. I keep learning Spanish, or I'm still learning Spanish. Sigo aprendiendo español. Continuamos viendo la serie. Continuamos viendo la serie. We keep watching the show. Continuamos viendo la serie. So we began to watch the show and we're still watching it. The structure is very similar to the progressive tenses with the verb estar. And then a fifth way to use the gerunds in Spanish is for gradual or repeated actions. And here we will use verbs like ir, to go, or andar, which is also a form of to go, to get around, to walk, to travel, to run. It has different meanings. So when something is happening little by little, we could use one of these verbs with the gerund. For example, voy mejorando mi español. Voy mejorando mi español. I'm gradually improving my Spanish. Voy mejorando mi español. Anda diciendo mentiras. Anda diciendo mentiras. He goes around telling lies. Anda diciendo mentiras. In English, gerunds can function as nouns, often serving as the subject or object of a sentence. In Spanish, we don't use the gerunds this way. Instead, we have to use the infinitive. This is what I mean. In English, we could say, I like reading. But in Spanish, we wouldn't use the gerund in that sentence. We wouldn't say, me gusta leyendo. Instead, we would use the infinitive verb, me gusta leer. Me gusta leer. Or another example is, swimming is fun. We wouldn't say, nadando es divertido. That is not correct. We will use the infinitive, nadar es divertido. Nadar es divertido. So that's a common mistake with gerunds in Spanish. A second mistake is using gerunds as adjectives. In English, a gerund adjective describes an ongoing action, but in Spanish we tend to use a relative clause. For example, the woman who is walking is my sister. We would think that something like that translates into la mujer caminando es mi hermana. But the correct way is la mujer que camina es mi hermana. La mujer que camina es mi hermana. Another example is the man wearing a hat. Here we think that it could be el hombre llevando un sombrero. But again, that is not correct. The correct way is el hombre que lleva un sombrero. El hombre que lleva un sombrero. So those are two mistakes that tend to happen when learning the gerunds in Spanish. So let's test your knowledge a little bit. Fill in the blanks with the correct gerund. So here we have yo leer un libro. How would you put this into the progressive tense? I'm reading a book. Yo estoy leyendo un libro. Yo estoy leyendo un libro. All right, how about this other sentence? María correr en el parque. How would you turn it into the progressive? María está corriendo en el parque. María está corriendo en el parque. María is running in the park. Buen trabajo. How about this one? Nosotros trabajar en un proyecto. How would you turn this into the progressive? We're working in a project. Nosotros estamos trabajando en un proyecto. Nosotros estamos trabajando en un proyecto. This can be a lot of information, but this is a beginner's guide on how to use the gerund. I talked a lot about verb conjugations, and if you want to learn more about that, I'll leave you this video here. Muchas gracias.